Um, Sige. So ito yung ating brief outline. I'll just emphasize yung psychological conceptualization of social class. And then I'll just provide a very, very brief overview of the two social class models that you've read so far. And then, kagaya na nabanggit ko kanina, hopefully the bulk of our discussion will focus on answering the question. So the point of the questions really is to force us to compare the two models. Kasi meron silang similarities na ipe-preempt ko na yung pair na magsasagot ng question number 1, at least for 1 point. And then makita natin saan sila nagda-diverge and then how they actually complement each other. Okay? And then let's focus on yung Q&A, at least for this reading, and then the quick reminders and announcements regarding our class requirements. Okay? Sige, let's talk about social class. So, balikan na natin, throwback tayo dun sa article nila Dimer et al. And it was important for me that we start with this article because I wanted us to reflect on ano ba yung psychological conceptualization ng social class. Diba? Kasi there are many ways to define it. But how does psychology do that? No? So, hopefully, naging malinaw yun sa inyo after that reading. I'd just like to introduce this concept to you. May encounter nyo pa to sa reading next week, but I figured I'd pull it up now because this kind of sets the tone for the conceptualization of social class. No? So, sina Sen and Wasau, sinuggest nila na yung psychological concept of race, baka daw mas maganda siya na tignan as bundle of sticks. No? Tapos sina Krauss et al., sinuggest nila, maybe we can also adapt that for social class. No? And if you think about it, a lot of the psychological concepts we have are conceptualized as a bundle of sticks. No? When you think about concepts like culture, when you think about concepts like self, no? Ang idea ng bundle of sticks ay hindi siya isang property, no, na can have an impact on behavior or feeling or thinking. No? But the idea here is that social class is too broad. No? It's too fine-grained that it's impossible to just talk about social class as a construct. No? Conceptually daw, ang hirap niyang gawa ng pag-aaral kapag, kunwari, ano yung effect ng social class sa health or sa academic engagement? Ang hirap daw niyang imagine at ang hirap niyang aralin kung social class ay isang malaking bultong ganyan. No? So, kailangan daw, importante sa conceptualization niya na i-disaggregate natin siya at yung aaralin natin yung constitutive elements ng social class. Okay? So, social class is this big concept, no? But for us to be able to investigate it, for us to be able to say, no, or infer which aspect of social class is really influencing behavior or feeling or thought, we have to talk about the elements or its components. Kaya siya bundle of sticks. Parang hindi siya isang bato, pero kundi hiwa-hiwalay siya, no, ng mga konsepto. So ang idea, kaya na nabanggit ko, each element or component should help explain how social class shapes experience. No? Now, if we will remember the Dimer et al. Article, and actually kahit sina Krauss, binabanggit nila to na kaya dalawa yung pag-measure ng social class, diba? Isa yung mas objective, no, indexed using that triumvirate measures, educational attainment, occupational prestige and income. No? Tapos meron pa silang ginagamit na MacArthur subjective scale of socioeconomic status. No? So iba rin yung ini-index niya na component. So yung idea, they are correlated. Ibig sabihin, they seem to be measuring the same underlying concept, but the correlation is not perfect. It's not one. In fact, the correlation is small, meaning they are related, but they seem to be tapping into a different component of social class. So that is the idea of this bundle of sticks conceptualization. We are looking at components that are tapping into different aspects of social class. Okay? So what is the important implication here? The important implication here is social class is constructed. Hindi siya set in stone. No? It can change. And I guess if we think about the idea of social mobility, we know that categories can change. If we think of social class as an identity, do you consider yourself as upper, middle, or lower class? The idea of social class as an identity is something changeable, is something mutable. Okay? And probably, if we extend it further, something unstable. Okay? Kasi nga, maraming nagbabago-bago eh. No? At yung isang importanteng theoretical implication which can be tested is that a change in one component may affect the other elements as well. So for instance, theoretically, if you have an increase in your educational attainment, ideally, it will also impact the income you will receive, the occupation, no? And then eventually, kung mas lumaki yung kita mo kasi na-promote ka, it can also have an impact on where you're going to live, no? Or your tastes in food, in art, in travel, no? And even how you view yourself. Okay? So I'm starting with this because for me, this is a very good way to conceptualize social class as a psychological experience. Any questions so far before I proceed? Pero na-proceed na. Is rank here po subjective?
Meron po,
Yes, yes. Rank here is the subjective social status. So we'll delve into that a little bit further. Kaya ko siya kinapitalize, kaya ko nilakihan yung ano niya. Kasi ito yung magiging focus natin today, yung rank at saka yung culture actually. Any other questions before I proceed? Okay, sige. So just, if in case you have it, we have a Q&A portion later on where you can ask questions. So now, syempre importante, how do we define social class? Okay? Now, si Dimer et al., meron silang definition ng social class. Pero yung what I really prefer to use ay yung definition nila Michael Krauss. No? Kasi very consistent siya with all our other readings in class. No? So yung definition nila is this, which actually hints at the social cognitive model of social class. No? So look at how it's defined. Social class is a context that an individual inhabits rooted in material resources and construal or perception of rank. Okay? So why do I like this definition? Kasi it already tells us two things. Yung social class is rooted, no, is based sa material resources. Actually, some definitions would even include social resources, the extent of your social network, the extent of your influence, no? But also, meron siya noong psychological experience of where you locate yourself in the social class ladder. Okay? What I like about this definition also is that it hints at, no, meron kang looking inward by looking at material resources. No? Gaano kayaman, gaano kalaki yung laman ng bank account ko, gaano kalaki yung bahay namin, no? Gaano kalaki yung family wealth, household income. But also, it tells us that social class, the experience of that requires social comparison. Okay? So for you to be able to say, or for you to be able to perceive where your rank is, it's important that you know where other people stand. Okay? So pag alam mo na where other people stand, it makes it easier for you to assess what's your rank, what's your subjective social status. Okay? So again, just to drive home the point about the definition of social class, importante to be clear how it is defined Importante to be clear how it is conceptualized kasi it has an impact on how it is measured. Okay? So kung babalikan natin itong definition na to, meron siyang objective components, no? Kaya yung measure din niya, yung, di ba yung tawag, in-index siya, no? Mini-measure siya based on these so-called objective measures, no? So may nagtanong dun sa reading memo, pero bakit siya objective, no? The main reason why it is considered objective, based on my understanding, is that it has well-defined standards or guidelines. So parang pinagkasundoan ng mga tao kung ano yung high, middle, low, kung ano yung occupation na mataas yung prestige score, no? At kung ano yung educational attainment na mataas or mababa. No? As opposed to the subjective component, your own construal of rank or status, it's, ano siya nagiging subjective siya kasi ang standard niya, ikaw. Hindi siya necessarily siniset ng lipunan o ng gobyerno, pero ikaw yung magtatakda or magdidikta kung nasaan ka dun sa social class ladder. So just a quick throwback. Did you notice in your engagement activity that I asked you to compare yourself with the worst off in society? Did that strike you as something weird? Or parang napansin nyo ba na meron siyang ganong specific I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. Sabi ni Adi, pag objective defined by consensus. Pag objective, I think, yeah, we can say that it's defined by consensus. The standards are set. Kasi halimbawa, income. Yung gobyerno natin, di ba kakalabas lang nila a few weeks ago nung, ano yung rate, parang upper but not rich.
Poverty.
Yung poverty, nila.
Poverty threshold.
Yes, that one. So that one is, merong consensus or standards or guidelines used for that.
Bali po sir, clarify ko lang.
Yes,
Yung
please.
sa occupational prestige, objective siya because the standards were defined by consensus of several people.
Yes.
Instead of subjective of one person lang. Okay.
Right. Kasi yung, in fact, I wanted to show it to you, kaya lang, hindi ko ma-pull up ngayon yung study. Pero kung titignan niyo yung table, di ba merong prestige-based measures, sina Dimer et al. Meron silang specific table. Tapos meron sila dong citation na binabanggit eh. Wait let me see if I can pull it up. But in any case, yung occupational prestige, as in, literally, meron talaga siyang score na naka-attach. So, there are various occupational prestige scores, but I remember, hindi ko to makalimutan kasi hinanap ko kung nasaan yung university professor. Tapos parang parang 100 yung highest. Tapos yung university professor, parang ang occupational prestige niya nasa mga 74, ganyan, yung score niya. Pero yung income, di masyadong sumasabay dun sa prestige. But in any case, ganun siya. So meron silang ina-assign na score. Kaya, pwede mo siya i-run statistically. I think yun yung point nila eh. Yung point nila ay, diba measurement, when we talk about measurement, it's assigning numbers to a phenomenon. So usually, they assign a number so that they can do more complex analysis with it.
Sir?
Yup.
Isa po. So, parang if gagamitin po natin yung occupational prestige along with the other two SES indicators, kunyari sa study namin, sa thesis, ganyan, or for a local study, ano po yung pwede nating gamitin? Kasi, or the same po ba yung ginamit nila, pwede po bang gamitin yun? Or do we have a local equivalent?
That's a good question. Hindi ko alam. Baka si Villy might know better. Kasi mas familiar siya doon sa mas national na mga surveys na gagawa. Personally, I haven't seen a measure of occupational prestige in the Philippines. So that will be my homework. Let me try to look for it. But I don't know, Villy, would you want to comment on that?
Sir, I think wala pong ganun. Kasi, nung binabasa ko po yung the idea of the prestige base, it's actually a collection of subjective SSS, kumbaga, collated to make an objective measure. And since ganun yung design niya, ganun yung atake niya, the PSA, for example, don't really do such studies. They rely based on what they can measure instead of what they can derive, kumbaga. So, as far as I know, wala pong prestige-based measures, especially occupational prestige. May mga numbers po, may mga data on how many blue-collar jobs or white-collar jobs can be classified as white-collar jobs, but it is not ranked.
Okay, thank you, Lily. So, yun, Adi, at least based on our experience, we've done quite a few studies on social class. We rarely use occupational prestige. It's usually resource-based measures. So, income, educational attainment, and then yung isang interesting measure that I've seen and that we've also used in the past ay yung ownership of household conveniences. So do you, at least ano lang siya, yes, no. Do you own microwave? Do you own TV? Do you own, and I think this was based on the survey that Billy was talking about. Do you own a car? Do you own a desktop computer? And then, ina-add up lang yun. Tapos, as it turns out, yun nga, it can differentiate. Apparently, may mga conveniences that can clearly differentiate um, lower sa upper class. May question si Nick about ano yung highest. If I can't find it now, I will. That's my homework. I'll just send it. I'll send you an email about the. Because it's a very old hand. It's like a guidebook na may mga source, pero sobrang luma na siya. So I don't even know if it's updated or something. Okay. Sige. Okay na? Any other questions before I proceed? Sige, so balikan ko lang yung ladder question ko sa inyo dun sa isa sa mga unang engagement activities natin. So sa Giant class, no, na tinanong ko kayo sa worst of. Kasi kung titignan nyo talaga yung MacArthur scale, it just asks you to compare yourself to a target group. Like for example, compare yourself to the Filipino society based using the rung where using the ladder where 10 are people who are best off and then 1 would be people who are worst off. Okay? So why did I ask you to compare yourself to the worst off? Kasi sina Krauss, ang kanilang hypothesis ay, so this is where dito nyo makikita yung nuance ng psychological conceptualization. Kina Krauss kasi, yung social class for them, pag inoperationalize nila, ay experience ng rank or experience ng status. Okay? So, ang sinasabi nila, if you compare yourself daw with the worst off, may tendency ka to feel higher in rank or mas tumataas yung perception mo of your status kahit na pansamantala lang. Okay? As opposed to, if I ask you, compare yourself to the best of in society, ang hypothesis nila Krauss dito, perceptually, mas bababa yung perception mo of your rank or your status, no? Which may be different from your objective status. Does that make sense? So, why is that important? Kasi sina Krauss, they do experiments on social class. Kaya lang, if we're familiar with the method of social class, alam naman natin na ano yung isang importanteng property ng experimentation? Manipulation, di ba? Of your independent variable. Kaya lang, hindi mo naman pwedeng sabihin na, kunwari, halimbawa, Mika, for now, ano ka muna ha, pretend that you're lower class, okay? So, tas ikaw naman, Pao, pretend that you're middle class, ganyan. So, hindi natin mamamanipulate yung social class ng mga tao. Pero kina Krauss, ang pwede daw nating mamanipulate ay yung experience of rank or status by comparing yourself with people who are best off and worst off. Okay? So, I just thought that that's a kind of a very important concept that we might need to to know. I think I shared this in our 208 class before. Hindi ko alam kung naalala pa ni Mika, pero I tried in a study that I did. I actually tried using that manipulation, but for some reason it didn't work. So hindi people don't seem to adjust their. And actually, nung binabasa ko nga yung mga yung mga engagement activities nila, sa isip ko rin, parang hindi yata naka-affect yung instruction dun sa perception ninyo of your social class standing. So, again, what is the important point here? Rank depends on comparison group. So, ano yung important na sinasabi ni na Krauss sa conceptualization nila? Posibleng mag-iba yung subjective social status mo depende kung sino yung comparison group. So that was also the reason why I asked you to compare yourself with your Facebook contacts. Kasi I was, in my head, yung hypothesis ko ay most likely that you'll probably be parang same circle yan. So more or less kapareho. So iba yan sa pag kinompare ko kayo halimbawa sa nasa Forbes list, iba pa sa mga estudyante sa UP, etc. etc. Okay?
Sir,
Yep.
sir, I think, or if I may be allowed to hypothesize,
Yes.
that's because when we compare ourselves with the worst of in society, we actually take note of what we have. If we compare ourselves with the best of in society, we compare ourselves to what we don't have. Kaya nagbabago siguro yung SSS natin.
Actually, that's a very interesting point.
Okay.
And you know what? It's an empirical question. I actually don't know if Sina Kraus ever tested that. You know, in fact, you can just hindi ko gaya lang nung ginawa ng engagement activity natin actually na use the use the ladder, just change the instructions, and then just ask people what was the basis of your answer. And then dun mo actually makikita kung the instructions mattered. Yeah. So that's a quick and dirty empirical study that you can explore um, tonight. Tonight. Okay. Sige. Anything else before I proceed? Okay. So, just quickly, I'll try to address some of your questions. There was a common sentiment that it's kind of overwhelming. The tables are very overwhelming. Parang ang daming measures at bakit ganun siya kadami. So, it signals to us that there is no best measure, that for a complex construct like social class, it's impossible to just have one or two or five. No? There are many different measures because there are many different conceptualizations. There are many measures because people have different purposes. No? Some are interested in household income, some are just interested in your own personal income, some are interested in wealth and poverty indices, etc. etc. So, depende talaga. So, yung tanong na how do you choose, it really depends on um, your purpose. No? If it's a crucial variable, my suggestion always is find a study that forms the basis of your decisions. Kasi at the end of the day, you just need to justify why you chose that measure. So, our justifications naman are usually based on literature review. So, kung may nakita kayong pag-aaral na ito yung ginamit, it sounds reasonable, it fits your purposes, then that's what we use. But based on experience, we're parang circling around a very limited number of measures actually. At nabanggit ko na nga yun kanina, yung ladder, yung educational attainment, income, tsaka yung conveniences. Meron bang advantages? So yung isang question din, may advantage din ba yung absolute versus relative measures of poverty? I thought that this is a very good question. Yung advantage niya ay kapag absolute yung measures mo, usually ito yung ginagamit nila to standardize the experience. So, ibig sabihin, importante siya for a lot of policy making, policy direction, kasi isa lang yung basis when we make the comparisons. No? Pero importante yung relative measures of poverty, and it's actually in a study that we did on living wages, we actually used relative measures. So bakit siya relative measures? Kasi usually yung participant o yung individual, siya yung nagde-decide ano yung importante sa kanya, tapos magkano yung kakailanganin niya based on that. Parang ganun siya. So relative siya sa individual, pero ina-aggregate siya dun sa sample para kaya mo pa rin gumawa ng statistical analysis. I don't know if I'm making sense, but yung advantage ng relative measures for me is that you take into account yung idiosyncrasies ng mga tao. Kasi yung absolute, halimbawa, yung pag-measure nila ng ano ba yung minimum wage. Yung isang ginagamit nila usually ay yung food basket approach. So, binabangga nila yung medyo nutritious na food, tapos parang pipili sila ano yung pinakamura, tapos magkano yung kailangan para ma-afford to ng isang pamilya composed of 5. No? So yun, wala kang choice. Kung ayaw mo yung ulam, yun yung ulam na binigay nila sa'yo. At yun yung basis ng computation ng minimum wage. Yung kainaman sa relative measures usually ay nakakalibrate siya based on what is important to someone. So the psychological component is apparent and it's considered. Okay? This is my question then about ano yung link between SES and SSS or link between the objective and subjective measures. So I think I answered this a while ago. They are related in the sense that they are related, they are correlated, they seem to be measuring the same underlying concept, but different in the sense that they're tapping into particular components. Okay? So the correlation is usually positive. I haven't encountered a negative one. Yeah. So ibig sabihin, as the objective measures increase, the subjective perceptions of social standing also increases. Okay. Sige. So now let's go to the overview of the social class models that we are studying so far. So dalawa pa lang sila, but they're actually highly related. Okay? Sige. So unahin natin yung social cognitive model. So ako, I love models with diagrams. I don't trust models without diagrams. Hindi, zero lang. Pero importante sa akin na merong ganitong visualization kasi it makes it easier to digest the main arguments. No? So pag tinignan natin to, we usually just move from left to right. No? So ano yung makikita nyo dito sa social cognitive model? Una, if a-flag ka niya, yung social class para sa kanya ay context, where a person inhabits. May ganyan siyang chika, di ba, kanina. Tapos, ano pa yung pagsisilipin mo siya from left to right. Crucial sa social cognitive model na anchored yung context sa material resources, but also sa perceptions of fact. Okay? At dahil dyan, meron siyang impact doon sa where you position yourself in the ladder. Yeah. So if we move from left to right, so yun yung crucial dyan. Ito yung social class as a psychological experience rooted in material resources and perception of rank, usually based on social comparison. Tapos, ano yung sinasabi niyang importante dito? Bakit sa social cognitive model? So, social cognitive model siya kasi meron pang gusto mag-try. So, ito yung crucial dito di ba? So, ang crucial dito, merong mga social cognitive patterns or habitual patterns of actually, basically, perception siya that also leads to particular behaviors that are associated with particular social class levels. Does that make sense? Sige, so let's try to break it down somewhere. Okay, so again, like what I previously mentioned, so yung social class is a context. It combines both objective and subjective aspects. No? And then, so it makes it social cognitive because the social class context, as it turns out, elicits these response patterns or patterns of perceiving the self, the environment, and your relationships. Okay? Meron pa kayong question about that?
Sir?
Yep.
Question ko lang po, parang Naisip ko po kasi if there are studies on how culture plays a role dito sa kanilang ladder model, parang naisip ko lang po kasi na in some cultures, kunyari in Japan or here in the Philippines, it's kind of customary for some to sometimes downplay how they would rank themselves for ano ba to, social something. Or may if or relevant po ba yung culture or hindi na siya significant kasi rank based naman siya or relative naman siya. I
It's
don't
an
know if I
excellent
made sense.
that's an excellent question. Let me see if I understood your question. So what you're saying is may effect ba yung culture sa how people perceive their rank or at least how people report their rank. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir. Or if significant or if relevant po ba itong effect na 'to? Kasi parang naisip ko po kunyari if we are conducting a study in one culture lang, for example, in the Philippines, and say everybody it's customary here to kunyari to downplay our rank. So, parang sa lahat naman nung respondents mo for that study, the same naman. So, parang irrelevant na rin whether culture plays a role or not. Or baka, ay,
That's a good question. I haven't really encountered itong gumamit itong social cognitive theory nila Krauss na mas cross-cultural. So but you're right. No, if you're only using it in the Philippines, so parang it evens it out. Although we're still assuming na homogeneous yung sample mo kahit sa Philippines, di ba? But my guess is there should be an effect somehow, actually. Kasi feeling ko halimbawa, in terms of like, yung tendency mo lang to socially compare to other people, to calibrate, I think that might be a more Asian thing, maybe, than a Euro-American or Western thing. So, my guess is it should have an effect, yung culture. But exactly how, that I'm not that sure. Parang hindi din, very silent din yung model on that. And I think that was one of the criticisms actually of the Krauss model. Parang silent siya sa cultural differences. There is an entire journal article devoted to it. It's actually a fascinating journal article. It's a fascinating issue of a journal wherein merong essay sina Krauss, itong social classes rank, and then yung next articles ay criticisms of the rank model. So isa yun, yung kawalan, parang silent nga siya on culture. For purposes of transparency, sociocultural self-model, actually later on sa revisions nila Stephens, sociocultural model na lang siya. And I'll show you the revision later on. This is actually my favorite social class model. Why? Because it takes into account para kina napakalino kasi para kina Stephens na yung social class for them is an immersive environment that shapes the self. So ang central construct talaga sa kanila, which is very social psychological, is the self, no? And again, nabanggit ko kanina, yung self, parang race, parang social class, no? Ang hirap din niya i-pin down. Kaya kung mapansin niyo, di ba sila Stephens, they interchange it with identity, no? In fact, dun sa ilang updates nila, they now use models of agency. At ang ganda ng concept na yun kasi para sa kanila, what social class shapes, social class as an immersive experience or environment shapes is that it shapes the kind of person that the culture values. Yun yung idea ng model of agency. And malamang na-encounter niyo yung disjoint, conjoint, independent, interdependent. So they sort of talk about the same thing and they refer to the self or the kind of person that is valued in a particular culture. No? So this is actually a more complex conceptualization of social class kasi napaka-crucial ng idea ng mutual constitution, di ba? Mutually constitutive yung structure at saka yung individual characteristics, meaning the effect on each other is bidirectional, no? Tapos also, they have an impact on the self. Tapos yung self, tsaka siya magkakaroon ng impact sa thought, feeling, or action. So, yung diagram, crucial na nasa gitna yung self. Kasi, statistically, if you've heard about mediation models, kaya kung mapapansin nyo, ilang ulit nilang binabanggit, di ba? Yung the effects of structure and individual characteristics are indirect sa thought, feeling, and action. Bakit siya indirect? Kasi dumadaan yung effect doon sa self. Yung self, yung parang sumasala, tapos siya yung nagkakaroon ng impact later on doon sa thought, feeling, or action. Or na ma-manifest yung effect sa thought, feeling, or action. I hope that made sense. So, ito yung mga kakabanggit ko lang sa inyo kanina. No? Just to reiterate, importante yung idea ng bidirectionality. No? Ibig sabihin, you cannot analyze one without the other. Yun yung kanyang implication. Self is the center of experience. So, ang titignan mo talaga dito, how your environment and how your personal characteristics shape the kind of self that you will have. And then later on, because of that, na ma-manifest yung effect nung environment and yung personal characteristics mo dun sa iyong thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Okay? Sige, I will move on. Nabanggit ko kanina na para dito sa sociocultural model, yung social class is an immersive cultural context. Ang argument kasi nila ay usually maraming mga tao na kung ano yung social class context na kung saan sila pinanganak, minsan yun na yung context nila until they die. No? And then as you can see in this diagram, there's a stark contrast between yung upper class at saka yung lower class. Diba? So makikita nyo naman yung spacious, marami kang dami mong malalakaran, parang very modern, as opposed to something that is cramped, no? As opposed to something that parang naririnig ng kapitbahay ninyo yung arguments that you're having, no? And that has an effect actually on the type of self that you will have, no? Ito yung kanilang update on their model, at least based on the US experience, and this is something that we might want to reflect on in the Philippines, no? So, in their model, what they're saying is, if you come from the lower class, yung mundo para sa'yo is uncertain. So that is the kind of context you are dealing with. No? You have limited resources, there's a lot of constraints. No? I think I mentioned this to you before, that yung poverty is actually manifested doon sa constraint na wala ka masyado freedom. And you feel like there's just low influence, choice, or control. As opposed sa kapag upper class ka, yung mundo para sa'yo certain. Diba? You can make plans. You don't need other people because you have a lot of resources. You can do things on your own. No? There's less constraint and there's a lot of choice, control, and influence. No? So what the sociocultural model is saying is that if this is the kind of environment you have, no, meron yan impact dun sa type of self that you will develop. No? Kaya they talk about interdependent self. If you come from the lower class environment, ito yung kind of self that you will develop. You will need other people, you're more responsive to cues, diba? Binabanggit din to nila Krauss. You're most likely to adjust to situations, you look for connections, you're aware of the hierarchy, as opposed to a more independent self ng mga upper class individuals, so that they can do it on their own. The emphasis here is what I want, what I need, no? And that I can express myself freely. Okay? So what do we know so far based on these two models? Okay. So itong social cognitive and social cultural models, actually, they provide explanations as to why the upper class and the lower class individuals have different psychological profiles. So kung mapapansin niyo yung kasaysayan ng social class research in psychology, ang unang inaral talaga ay ano yung pagkakaiba ng mga tao in the lower class and in the upper class. Right? So sina Krauss, ang dami nilang hypothesis. I think they have 9 hypotheses for that, diba? Of their differences. Yung sociocultural model, ganun din. Sinasabi din niya, bakit magkaiba yung mga tao? And in fact, kung papansinin niyo yung framing, yung social inequality, given. Diba? Na merong inequality in terms of academic achievement, in terms of health. No? So, ang sinasabi lang nila dito, bakit ganun? Bakit magkaiba? So we're talking about differences in psychological profiles here. Okay? But, what does a sociocultural self-model introduce? It actually, kasi magandang segue to dun sa topic natin next meeting, at habang pinag-isipan na natin as slowly yung social inequality, it now presents us a possible theory of change. So when we talk about theories of change, we talk about ano yung mga mechanisms na importante if I want to craft or design an intervention. So kailangan malinaw sa'yo what are the variables I'm dealing with, what are the factors I'm dealing with, kasi sila yung magpapaliwanag kung bakit mo ine-expect na may magbabago if you change one component or one factor. Does that make sense? Yung kay Krauss et al. Kasi hindi pa sila masyadong nagde-dwell into the mechanisms for change. They're just saying, we're different because we have habitual patterns as a result of the contexts that we're at. Pero ito sina Stephens, nag-move na sila towards, ano yung mga pwede natin gawin? Now that we've identified that you become interdependent, you know, if this is your context, you become more independent if this is your context, what now can we tweak so that we can provide interventions and reduce inequality? Okay. Questions so far? Sige. So let me just briefly share with you some of your questions doon sa social cognitive model. Mamaya yung questions ninyo sa sociocultural. Something struck me, no? Meron sa inyo nagsabi na, after nyo mabasa yung article nila Krauss, parang I don't want to be rich anymore. No? Kasi nga, parang yung framing dun sa Krauss study, parang ang sama nung, wala nang value judgment necessarily yung psychology, no? Pero yung idea na, you know, you're less generous, you're less empathetic, you're less, you know, conscious about your environment and social cues, etc. No? So parang may rosy picture na pinipaint kapag lower class ka, no? However, I'd like to say na dun sa isang research na ginawa nila Nicole Stephens, yung author ng sociocultural model, nakita nila na yung poverty or yung pagiging lower class, meron siyang threshold, no? That at some point, when you become really poor, or pag talagang sobrang constrained ka dahil sobrang konti ng resources mo, can you guess kung anong type of self yung nade-develop sa'yo? Because actually, nagiging independent siya. So yung lahat ng mga sinasabi about higher empathy, higher generosity, etc. about the lower class, so there's a threshold. No? At some point, mas nagiging solipsistic. Yeah, correct. No? Mas nagiging solipsistic yung people who are very poor. So now they don't depend on others, they just focus on themselves. They're actually distrustful of other people when you're very poor. No? At interesting kasi yung study nila Stephens ay qualitative. They did interviews sa parang poor black women affected by a hurricane. So kung mapapansin niyo, bakit ganun yung picture na pinresent nila Krauss? A lot of their studies actually used student samples. So hindi siya, we're not talking about extremes here. A lot of the experiments and studies of Krauss, they are artificially manipulate social class standing. So hindi siya necessarily objective differences ng upper versus lower. So that might be one reason why it looks that way. Second, after reading Stephens, I don't know if this statement will still hold true. Because as it turns out, if you're a member of the upper class, you're healthier, you have a lot more positive outcomes in terms of academic achievement. And so there's that kind of trade-off, I think, in terms of the psychological profiles of those classes. A lot of you actually ask about particular hypothesis of Krauss. Yung pro-sociality, the empathy components, do they hold true or do they hold up even in the Philippines? It's an empirical question. So that's something that we need to test. In fact, I like that reading because they just present hypotheses. Of course, they've tested that, using American samples, but it's something that we can think about and see whether we can test them here in the Philippine context. My guess is baka parts of it hindi mag-hold up. No? Kasi tandaan natin na sa US, ang cultural ideal nila ay independence. Yun talaga yung parang standard. Inisip ko halimbawa sa Philippines or sa a lot of Asian contexts na very interdependent yung importante, baka iba yung maging consequences. And then finally, there's also a question about psychological profiles of the middle class, which I think is a fantastic question because a lot of studies or a lot of the things that we've been reading are very silent on the middle class. My reflection there is because inequality compares the upper and the lower. Parang yung middle, hindi nila masyadong sinasali, which I don't know if it's a smart thing to do or if it's a measurement thing, But yeah. So wala tayo talagang profile ng social class. We can surmise, na baka pag middle class ka, meron kang parts na alam na rules ng pang-upper, meron kang alam na rules na pang-lower, but that's an empirical question.
So who are the middle class? Siguro yun yung question. Kaya ang hirap i-conceptualize or i-measure, i-compare ang middle class against upper class and the lower class because there's no clear demarcation of you being a middle class.
That's true. Parang kung titignan niyo yung mga absolute measures natin of poverty, yun indicative na eh. Ang tinitignan talaga nila ilan yung poor. So yun malinaw. Tapos meron kang usually threshold ng paano mo masabi na rich in the Philippines. But the middle class is a little bit more nebulous and I feel like it's also a little bit more, what is the word? You have a category more permeable. Parang mahirap, I mean, yeah. So I do agree with what Billy is saying na there's a bit more ambiguity with this category.
Sir, I agree, especially because the middle class could actually construe themselves as a lower class din, madalas. Or as an upper class kapag nasa upper middle class naman sila. Mga ganun.
Yeah. So actually, a lot of the studies din ng social class in the US, ang isa sa mga dinedemonstrate nila is how we misperceive our own social class ranking, our objective social class ranking. And that we really have a tendency to consider ourselves as middle, kahit objectively baka hindi. Yeah. So hopefully that's what we know so far. So ngayon, let's fine-tune a bit yung alam natin by comparing the two models. Okay? So I asked you, did you have time to do this? I asked you to pair up. So yung pairs ninyo, that would be yung pair for the integration activity. Okay? So each pair, I asked you to think about the questions and then share your answers with the class. Okay? That was assigned to the pair. How does the sociocultural self model differ from the rank based model of social class? Please take it away.
Ayan. Yung question, rank-based model versus the social-cultural model, yung pinagkaiba nila. Pinansin po namin yung yung talagang na-emphasize. So yung for the rank-based model, relative siya to others. May comparison siyang nagagawa. So, kunwari yung picture dito, like, may isang guy na, compare niya siguro sarili niya to this guy na may mas maraming pera or resources than him. Tapos, emphasis din on a hierarchy na parang may existing hierarchy na kung may differences kung nasaan ka sa ladder or relative kung saan ka mismo. And sa social-cultural self-model, hindi masyadong emphasized yung comparisons between people or where you are, pero more on the individual first and most importantly yung focus din sa self. Kaya I think yung sa reading at least yung social-cultural self-model yung nakalagay. So to just to show them the differences, like inisip din namin na just example lang din siguro na medyo familiar. So kunwari if we try to understand siguro using the rank-based model and the susceptibility to COVID-19, parang papakita dito kung ano uh, yung resources more relative to those who have siguro like more resources than you or less resources than you to avoid infection or ayun, parang may comparison din or acknowledgement na may pagkakaiba sa susceptibility to COVID because of your social class. Um, on the trying to understand susceptibility to COVID using the sociocultural self naman is ay may focus din sa self. So yung nag-mention din na the individual and the structural. So kunwari sa individual, pwede tingnan din yung immunity mo or kunwari sa age mo na medyo siguro related din sa condition mo or sa immunity mo or like sa structural na yung access mo to healthcare or yung lugar mo sa ano, or yung location mo kung may crowding ba o wala. Tapos siguro yung sa ano, naisip din yung since these are not two independent things, kunwari yung individual factors are able to kunwari change din yung mga structural. So kunwari like having more capabilities, you're able to I guess change your environment to create more space for you to have like less chances of being infected. And at least sa nabasa namin sa reading, well, I'm not sure about the rank-based model din. Parang mas clear din na how to use that information to focus more on also interventions. So yun lang actually yung, I'm not sure if that is a very short description of the differences between the rank-based model. Pero yun po yung pagkakaintindi namin ni Pao.
Sure, yeah. How is there anything else like
Hello,
that?
to
Yes,
add
please.
din, yes po, siguro dun sa second slide ni Nick, yung parang mga tao to na nasa jeep eh. So parang I was thinking na we can apply this sociocultural model dun sa current na nangyayari sa bansa natin dito sa gitna ng pandemya, like yung mga mahihirap parang kahit na sabihin nila siguro na gusto nila magstay sa bahay, hindi nila yun magagawa kasi parang yung structure na meron sila, kailangan nilang kumita, kailangan nilang trabaho. So parang kahit na gusto nila na mag-ingat from COVID, yung structure hindi sila allowed to do so. So parang nakita ko dito sa model na to, dun sa sociocultural model na talagang talagang laging magkasama yung individual at yung structure kasi parang regardless of what we want, gustuhin man natin, let's say na mag-aral or gustuhin man natin na maging ligtas, sometimes hindi natin yun nagagawa because of the environment dun sa structure na meron tayo. Ayun po.
Okay, thank you. Those are excellent points. Anything else that the class would like to add? Meron ba kayong, do you agree? Do you think they got the difference between the two models?
Gusto ko lang pong
Yes, please.
i-clarify. Kasi yung isang dinidiscuss namin ni Raisa, parang we're trying to look at the two models. For example, how they answer one question. So, kunyari, nawala ako. What is social class dun po sa rank-based model? Na parang doon, social class is defined by SES and SSS, simply put. Tapos that the ranking affects psychological tendencies of the person.
Correct,
Tapos
yes.
parang paano po sa social-cultural model, does it define social class as a context that is built by individual and conditional structural factors? Ganun po ba yung definition niya ng social class? Or hindi ko po masyadong ma-place kung nasaan yung social class dun sa sa diagram or sa model nila kanina.
Correct. That was the reason why. Thanks for that, Al. That was the reason why I showed you the more updated model for the sociocultural kasi sa kanila, nililinaw nila na yung social class is an immersive context where people reside. Mas ganun siya. Parang it's a context that is characterized by access to resources. And then, in this, kaya importante yung qualifier nila na immersive kasi yung idea nila na nakababad ka doon, matagal kang nakababad doon, at saka yung environment mo na yun or yung context mo na yun, it shapes the kind of self that you're going to have. So parang simply put, ano siya, it's a cultural context sa kanila. Kina Stephen. So in that regard, kaya kung mapapansin ninyo, in that regard, meron silang similarity na in the sense that if yung people in the same social class standing, more likely may commonalities sila because of their lived experiences and how they understand themselves and how they behave. Parang yun walang contention, right? Na parang yung sinasabi ni Stephen at ni Krauss, pag upper class ka, more or less, ito yung profile mo. Pag lower class ka, more or less, ito yung profile mo. Pag sina Stephen yung tanungin mo, ang dahilan doon ay dahil most likely kung saan ka nakatira at yung iba't ibang mga konteksto kung saan ka nakikipag-interact. So like schooling, crucial yan kina Stephens. Workplace, yan, kasama yan sa kanila.
Saan po dun yung individual characteristics? Sorry.
Hindi
As a
sila,
cultural context.
kung tama yung pagkakaintindi ko, sa kanila kasi yung, nabanggit ni Nick kanina, yung kaya hindi masyado nagbabago yung social class contexts natin. Kasi yung mga individuals who reside there, parang more or less, they perpetuate that kind of environment. Does that make sense? So halimbawa, so yung environment ko ay mataas yung uncertainty kasi mahirap yung community namin. So therefore, may magandang halimbawa. Mataas yung threat vigilance ko. So I kind of distrust people. So yung mataas na distrust line, I bring that in almost all the interactions I go. However, dahil hindi ko naman kayang baguhin yung community namin, so parang magpaperpetuate lang yun na forever tayong distrustful sa isa't isa. Kasi yung neighborhood natin magulo.
Kasi di ba sir, like medyo may focus sa self nung sa diagram. Tapos parang may, like, mukha siyang like a cycle, in a way, na may
Yes, correct.
to the self. And I wonder then, like, if kasama din yung parang yung model na yun, tapos naisip yung diagram, and then kind of like, i-connect siya to a similar diagram na also affects others. Like yung mismong your siguro yung nangyayari din sa individual and then sa structural na sa'yo lang, nakaka-apekto din sa iba and their own control of selves.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think, Nick, I may be wrong, pero parang yung, at least itong binasa natin na sociocultural model, hindi siya, wala pa siya dun sa level ng how the psychological profile affects other people, yung choices mo, how they are affected. Kasi at least ang sinasabi niya dito ay, this is how particular profiles are developed. Mas ganun pa siya. Palang siya.
Sir,
Yes?
yung relationships po ba with other people, is it included dun sa structural conditions or yung structural is just really structural? Hindi involving yung relationships or other people?
My understanding is structural siya in the broadest sense. I think they mentioned that. So parang they talk about pwede siyang size ng classroom, pwede siyang a neighborhood, no? Pero you're right, no? What shapes that particular structure necessarily ay yung klase ng interaction that goes on there. Ang problema, parang hindi siya necessarily nakaka-capture ng model as it is, if that makes sense. Kasi kung titignan ninyo yung mga type of interventions that they're making, hindi ano siya nakahiwalay siya dun sa mas komplikadong how these particular structures are built and maintained and perpetuated. Does that make sense? Did you, I don't know if you also saw
Yes.
that. Pero ganun
Yes,
yung,
sir.
ganun yung dating eh. Kaya yung interventions nila, hindi pa siya cultural. In the sense that mas parang cosmetic yung changes than changing the actual belief systems and how people interact.
Bali, sir, their recommendation is to make make the structure, for example, uniform across all social levels, objective-wise.
To make the structure flexible so that it won't ang point kasi ang bottom line nila ay how do we reduce inequality. So yung point nila, meron tayong mga rules sa university na nagpa-perpetuate ng inequality. So how do we kind of make those adjustments? Hindi siya necessarily to accommodate lang. It's really, how do we make the changes such that may mga hindi maagrabyado or hindi maiiwan.
Okay.
So ang question
So
natin,
our
before you proceed, ang question natin ay based on the model, how is social class produced and maintained over time? So hopefully makover natin dito yung interaction ng structure and individual characteristics. Okay, go.
Okay. So the question, in order to address the question, we need to address first the sociocultural self-model of Stephens. And basically, we answered the question that social class or social class disparities in health and education, for example, in other institutions, are produced and maintained over time through the interaction of the individual characteristics or the IC and structural conditions, and of course, the social-cultural control of the self. Basically, the basic tenets lang naman na dinidiscuss ni Sir kanina, may simultaneous bidirectional relationship, ang individual characteristics and structural conditions. And this shapes or there emerge, kumbaga, yung social-cultural self mo that actually is your source of meaning that enables you as an individual to interpret your situation, hence will guide your behavior. Kaya yung ABC kanina, affect, behavior, and cognition is affected by how you interpret the world. And how you interpret the world is shaped by your social-cultural self. I understood the social-cultural self, or we discussed, na parang mas pinanggagalingan niya is past experiences and context. Okay. So, we actually presented four hypotheses or four scenarios in which social class or social class disparities is maintained. So the first one is when the individual characteristics and the structural conditions are absent. For example, yung mga children uh, who experience child labor, for example, since they don't have the skill or the individual characteristics, and they also don't have the proper structures that would help them in education, for example, disparities or social class disparities is maintained. So in scenario 2 naman, even if the individual characteristics is present, but the structural conditions are absent. For example, naalala niyo ba yung McDonald's story ng isang bata na nagbabasa siya sa life ng McDonald's? I think that's a viral story for some time. And people would actually say na parang, this person has grit, has self-discipline because despite the absence of of the structural conditions, he was hardworking enough. He has the individual characteristics to study. However, social class disparities is still maintained because hindi siya makakasabay sa mga upper class, for example, who has the time, who has enough structural conditions that would support them to study. So in scenario 3 naman, where individual characteristics is absent but the structural conditions are present, ang example dito madalas yung scholarships na binibigay nila o di kaya, example, the scholarships for example. So if the adolescent is given a scholarship, yet wala siya ng individual characteristics, for example, of self-efficacy, gaya ng dinidiscuss sa libro, social class disparities in education will still be maintained. Another example are farmers. They are skilled, they are disciplined at their work, but because they do not own the land, because the structural conditions are not met, kumbaga, their social class is maintained. Okay. And in scenario 4 naman, where both the individual characteristics and the structural conditions are met, however, the sociocultural self is not congruent or hindi nila nakita yung sarili nila basically as doing the task, hindi pa rin, mag-maintain pa rin yung social class disparities. An interesting story na naaalala ko on this premise or in this scenario is in one of my in one of my development course classes kung saan nagkwento yung prof ko about an NGO helping um, helping households in order for them to help against poverty. Basically, the NGOs would provide the training, sales training on this household. And also, magbibigay din sila ng puhunan. So ngayon, nagtataka yung NGO, bakit after 3 months kung saan na-train sila, meron na silang individual characteristics, meron pa silang puhunan, meron silang structural condition, na-meet yung structural conditions yung material needs nila. Bakit kaya sila tumitigil? And when they ask it, and this is a true story, ang sagot ng household is because nakabili na ako ng TV. Okay? So the idea there is, hindi niya nakikita yung sarili niya na doing that. She's not doing that because she has set a goal for her, and because her goal is met, okay, hindi na siya congruent sa self niya. Another idea is siguro personal experience. My mom, I would ask my mom sometimes, bakit hindi natin expand yung store natin? Bakit hindi natin expand yung store natin since nag-work naman ako, I can support? And my mom would usually answer that, nag-store naman ako para masuportahan ko kayong mag-aral, and I don't see the point of expanding it. Ngayon na nakatapos na kayo. So, that's our hypothesis for. And that's the reason why the social class disparities are still maintained. Now, our understanding of how social class is produced, if production means social class ranking, then we should meet the fifth hypothesis or the scenario 5, where the IC and the SC are both present and the social-cultural self is congruent. People have certain construals kasi on the basis of their social class. Okay, so when taken separately, the structure and individual approach are too narrow. Both are necessary conditions, but they are not sufficient, okay, in changing or in making a difference or in closing the social class disparities. So, individual construal is important. Individual construal is important. So, yun. Next slide po. Ayan. So, basically, this is just a rehash of how we answered the question. Okay, so para lang mas maintindihan siguro siya in a more simplistic and para lang din ma-summarize. Okay po. Ma'am, Ate Jessa, you might want to add.
Hi. So when we were discussing the different scenarios on like how it is maintained, that's the main hypothesis. I mean that's the main thing that we realized, that all three needs to be present. Hindi siya majority na like if 2 out of 3 are present and may magbabago na, but it's actually all of them that needs to be present, not necessarily in the equal percentage, pero basta nandun yung possibility para maging maintain siya. And when we're discussing it kasi with the different scenarios, we tried to also flip like paano kung, kasi most of the examples that we gave were on the lower class. What if it is an upper class? So parang I think we had a discussion na parang sa mayayaman, even if hindi sila makatapos ng college and ganun, mayaman pa rin sila. So, parang ganun siya for us. Yun.
Thank
Thank you
you.
po. If you have questions,
Yes,
yun po.
please. That is actually very clear. Maganda yung example about the meaning of something kasi yan nga, it's related to the self. And yeah, I really like that example about both character. You're hardworking, it's there, you have the opportunity through the structure, but for you, it doesn't mean anything. So, um, wala ring nagbabago. Hindi ko alam if that's also related to been we've always had problems with housing and ang tawag dito yung ano yung term pag nilipat mo yung isang community to another parang supposedly better uh, environment or community but parang nirelocate yung isang um, uh, urban poor community. So sa kanila, so maraming problema. That's why a lot of these projects don't work. So yung isa, um, in terms of characteristics, they're willing to take care of their house, they're very excited to do it. Pero ang problema, structurally, walang trabaho. Well, dun sa area kung saan sila tinatapon, some far-flung community na there's no work, it's too far from their work. So they don't want to move there. Or for them, it's not their idea of home. So yan yung mga kailangan i-contend with ng mga housing projects. Kasi hindi siya, kaya may problema pa rin tayo sa space and housing. Kasi may mga aspects na hindi na-address. Any other?
So I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Siguro to add lang din,
Yes, please.
we are discussing kanina how interventions are really hard to imagine kapag lalapatan mo ng sociocultural self-model. However, I noticed while reading, since coming from a development course class, that these interventions are actually present in the community, especially in capability approach. If you've read Sen and Nussbaum, they actually contextualize development on the basis of what people value. So ano nga ba yung gina-value ng tao? And they'll start there. So in a sense, that's very social-cultural self-model.
So our question is, okay, about, it's based on the social cultural model. How does social class shape important life outcomes? So we tried to answer this through scenarios using the model. So medyo dinisect namin siya and we tried to illustrate it through the model. So for the first scenario, we tried to work within the context na yung pag-shift to the learning modes, to the distance learning modes ngayon during the pandemic. And then we started with the self. For this example, meron yung self namin is, wait, sorry, nagpi-play siya mag-isa. Okay, so yung self namin for this scenario is may identity siya, is yung identification niya is with the lower class. So yung structural conditions na available sa kanya is the lack of access to resources for online learning. So pwedeng wala siyang laptop, wala siyang PC, or wala rin siyang internet connection. Or kung meron mang internet connection is very limited, baka prepaid, and that's not very conducive for online learning. Sorry. So yun. Yung available din sa kanyang, parang inassume din namin na yung available sa kanyang condition din for the school is yung mapaprovide lang sa kanya is yung learning modules, since yun lang yung pwede niyang magamit for that condition na meron siya, na pwede niyang i-access at their own pace. And then, considering yung context ng pandemic, which is biglaan siya, so teachers may still lack the preparation and the training for distance learning. And then, we also included there the living conditions may not be as conducive for studying remotely or learning. So, sorry, nagpe-play siya mag-isa. Okay, so individual characteristics, binase namin siya dun sa readings na associations with the lower class. So meron siyang, ang associated for the lower class is the lower self-efficacy, lower level of cognitive abilities, and then lower self-regulation. Um, so itong mga structural conditions and individual characteristics, they may interact and they may influence one another to form yung self, kung to form yung self, kung ano yung nade-develop na meanings nung self, nung person, and then what kinds of motivations yung nabubuo sa kanya given the interactions within the structural conditions and the individual characteristics. Um, sa ganitong context, pwedeng yung maging resulting feelings, thoughts, and behaviors niya is these ones na feelings of inadequacy to pursue or comply with academic requirements, and they may not be able to perform well academically, given na dahil may lack of motivation na din siya to perform academically dahil wala siyang resources to access the learning uh, learning materials. And then, we also included there the possibility na pwedeng isipin na lang din the person might just think about discontinuing their studies. And if they do that, they may find it challenging to obtain well-paying jobs in the future in their desired profession or company. And nung actions and feelings na yon, they may recur or they may bring it back to their structural conditions na parang dahil hindi naman siya makakuha ng magandang trabaho, parang ma-retain din yung lack of access niya, parang ma-retain yung pagiging lower class niya pa rin. So, and same with that, dahil hindi siya nakatapos sa pag-aaral, may limited knowledge and skills lang din siya. So, in sum, this is what we're trying to say for the scenario 1. For lower SES, pwedeng ang kanyang life outcome is negative. So that maybe discontinued educational goals and lower chance for decent employment. And then the next scenario is the same, working on the same context, but we're working with this higher SES. The person is identified as an upper class. So the structural conditions, they will have enough access to resources for online learning, and then they may be able to afford yung schools na pwede rin silang mag-provide ng more learning module, like learning resources, like not just printed, pwede rin silang mag-provide ng digital or online classes. And teachers might, in that institution, might also be more capable of handling this shift in learning modes. And then there will also yung consideration of the living conditions, baka mas conducive din para sa mga upper class to study remotely. And then here, the individual characteristics, yung associations then based on the readings, higher self-efficacy, higher level of cognitive abilities, and higher self-regulation. And that may develop the self wherein one is more academically able and mas motivated siya to perform academically. So this might be the thoughts and the feelings and the behaviors that might result from that developed self. So this is feeling more feeling more able to pursue or to comply with the academic requirements given na mas motivated sila and mas may resources sila to comply. And they may perform well academically. And syempre, they can continue their studies without much drawback kasi, well, continuous lang din naman sila although pwedeng may drawbacks but it's not very as that, pwedeng hindi ganun kalaki yung effect sa kanila. And then if they continue that, then they may be able to confidently aim for more well-paying jobs in the future. So, yung pagbabalik niya dun sa kanilang structural conditions, they may still retain their access to the resources given na may access sila to, may malaking possibilities for them to get a better profession with well-paying position since they also have better knowledge and skills dahil nag-continue sila ng studies. So this is our scenario 2, which is with the higher SES, pwedeng mas positive yung life outcomes sa kanila. That is through, in terms of fulfilled educational goals and then higher chance for decent employment. this is like, ano lang, parang overall lang namin. So, social class affects the structural conditions where one operates the characteristics an individual develops in the self, which forms one's identity or how one perceives themselves within their social class and forms their meanings and motives. These elements continuously interact and influence one another, wherein the self eventually translates into resulting behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. And these then affect how one lives their life and brings them to certain life outcomes. So yung examples namin, the scenarios that we gave were more, we thought were more typical of of their social class. So yung next question actually namin ni Fatima is, paano kaya or what are the possibilities para mabago kaya itong assumptions na 'to na kapag na kahit lower SES ka, puwede ka pa rin magkaroon ng positive life outcome or kahit high SES, puwede ka pa rin it's still a possibility na magkaroon ka ng negative life outcome. So, I think that's a question for the next pair. So, yun po.
Thank you so much. Fatima, is there anything else? Are we good?
Yes po, sir. Yay.
Okay,
Thank you,
so
Jen.
much. Thank you, Jen and Fatima. Actually, yung tanong ni Adi kanina, I think you were able to answer that. I don't know. I think, Adi, I hope it's clear now how the three factors interact to produce particular outcomes. Parang yun yung kainaman dun sa diagram. Pati din dun sa scenario, halimbawa na present nila Vili and Jessa. So, if you tweak a particular component, then maybe you have an idea what will happen. So, halimbawa dyan yung pinakita ninyo na diagram, di ba? So, halimbawa, high SES siya pero wala siya ng particular characteristic. So, maybe that will have, pwedeng the outcomes are still the same, pwedeng mas negative, etc. So, sige, for question number 4, how can practitioners develop interventions that will help reduce social class disparities? So knowing what we know, actually I'm so happy. So knowing what we know dun sa first 3 groups, how can we put them together for particular interventions?
Ayan. Okay, so, ayun guys, so diba so far naman, na-outline na natin lahat tong 3 factors na to, diba? So we have the self, individual characteristics, and then the structural conditions. So sa diagram naman, we just wanted to center, diba kanina parang in-emphasize na sir na self talaga yung center ng sociocultural self-model natin. Pero for the interventions, we wanted to center on behavior. Kasi yun yung parang goal niya na baguhin, diba? So, when we talk about interventions, we have to identify 3 things. So first is the current self, diba? Current self, and then we want to identify the desired behavior for the current self. So ano ba yung gusto natin ma-achieve nung current self na yun, right? Pero before that, we have to first look into the desired self. Diba? So parang, yung sabi sa reading natin, diba, we have direct and indirect methods. So we have to look at the content. So yung self mo na yung parang i-evaluate natin. We evaluate yung meanings and then yung content ng self to evaluate yung meaning ng behavior na yun for the self. Nag-gets niyo ba ako? Parang redundant. Pero yun, diba? Parang ilang ulit na rin naman sinabi ng ibang classmates natin na they have to be congruent. This is what I think sila Vili said dun sa scenario 5 nila. Diba? Na the self has to be congruent with the behavior. Parang kailangan, in a way, meaningful for them or gusto nila gawin yung behavior na yun para eventually ma-achieve nila yun and ma-sustain. Okay? So ideally, in interventions, you want the 3 factors to parang they have to be integrated. So, kailangan ng integration ng tatlo para magkaroon ng sustained behavior. So, they depend on the interdependence. Okay? So, meron kaming, we came up with a concrete example, siguro, para mas ma-imagine natin yung scenario. So, we wanted to incorporate siguro an example on mental health, assuming na meron siguro sa atin dito na iba na gusto maging practitioner ng mental health or baka ako lang yon. So clinical major po ako. And siguro drawing on my experiences so far, so nag-volunteer kasi ako to be a psychosocial volunteer for Psych Serve the past months bago mag-school. Ayan. And yung nakita naming problem so far, or ako sa mga naging kong clients talaga, parang consistently throughout sa kanila, ang problem nila when the pandemic came is emotion regulation. So, parang controlling negative emotions. Ayan. So, the current self na yung current self na identify namin is identifying as part of the lower class. So, specifically, we wanted to contextualize it as a student, o diba, para medyo nakaka-relate tayo. So, parang a student from the lower class who has no choice but to participate in online learning amid the pandemic. So, yun, imagine natin na yun yung ina-evaluate natin na current self. Okay, and yung desired behavior natin is we want that current self to achieve emotion regulation. So, parang mental health through emotion regulation. Okay? Pero upon evaluation, hindi gaano ka-relevant yun, diba? Like, we can see a scenario na hindi siya ganun ka-congruent dun sa individual. Kasi, yun, so dun na papasok yung ibang individual and structural conditions natin, diba? So, so the individual can sense na parang hindi naman, diba, parang top priority ngayon, especially amid the pandemic, ang schooling, diba? You have other needs to prioritize. So, yung tutulong ka sa trabaho, kung mayroon man trabaho yung magulang mo para may pangkain or pambili ng masks, pambili ng face shields, etc. Ayun, and then structural condition, syempre, yung kinakaharap natin na daily stressors, right? So, yun, yung stress pa lang in looking for resources, and then you have other stressors sa paligid na nakaka-contribute. So, what we do, for the intervention, so merong pinropose na parang 2 hypotheses or 2 steps si Stephen. So number 1 is to make that current self congruent with a desired self, right? So we kind of have to frame it. So I can imagine parang like in a clinical setting or ayun, parang pagkakausapin mo yung client mo, you have to kind of frame your goal in a way na makaka-relate, kumbaga, yung client mo, or parang magigets niya in a way yung importance kung bakit kailangan niya ma-achieve yung emotion regulation. So what we thought of is, yun, like you can frame it in a way na bakit ba kailangan, even if you're lower SES, diba, parang what is the importance of actually pushing through with online learning despite everything else? So syempre, for them, important, or parang we assume na important yung achieving a better future. So we connected na, diba, you have, like, for you to achieve a better future, important din yung education, syempre, diba, like, when you find jobs, etc., etc. So we have to kind of reframe, parang cognitive reframing siya in a way. Okay, and then second, after that, so assuming na parang naggawa ng congruent yung current self with the desired self, we now have to make sure na, diba, parang okay na yung self, kumbaga. Yung hypothesis 2, parang posits na yung individual and structural conditions mo have to support that self. Ideally, both factors have to support the self. Diba? Kasi, ayun, so if we put the individual characteristics, so kung na-provide parang na-provide yung individual characteristics as stated on the diagram, diba? So, nabigyan mo siya ng technical knowledge about gadgets and skills. Parang naturuan mo ng skills on how to cope. So, may breathing exercises, mindfulness exercises. Okay, present yon. But then, okay, marunong nga siya mag-cope, diba? Parang marunong siya, the person knows how to do all of these things. Pero kung yung structural conditions mo naman will not foster these individual characteristics, hindi rin siya masusustain. Diba? So parang, ayun, parang tuturuan mo siya mag-breathing exercises, mag-mindfulness exercises, pero araw-araw, ang dami niyang kinakaharap na other structural stressors. Siguro gagana yung exercises na yun, like, like like for one day or like 1 week at the most. Pero eventually, it's all going to be circular, di ba? Babalik at babalik siya. And in reverse, if you provide naman yung parang structural conditions lang, hindi rin siya gagana, or parang it won't be as complete as well. So we put here structural conditions. So yun, kunyari, meron na nga siyang internet access, meron siyang laptop, meron siyang tablet, and then yun, kung meron pa siyang access to a therapist or to a psychologist. But then, so andun, present yung structural conditions mo, pero wala ka naman nung individual characteristics. So wala ka namang skills or wala kang technical knowledge, diba? Parang hindi rin siya masusustain. So, just to some, diba? Parang for interventions or for practitioners to apply this model sa interventions, yung key thing lang talaga is for integration of everything. So, yun. Ano, may gusto ka bang idagdag kahit through ano?
That's great. I think we should show this to UP.
Pa-present ko na sa Psych serve, sir. Joke lang.
I think I'm working.
Yes, we hear you.
Ayan, okay.
There's something wrong with my mic, so I'm just screaming at my laptop right now. So I'm sorry if it's fuzzy. I think Nika was able to explain it very clearly. I just like to point out that this is not the model of the sociocultural self, especially after Sir Ton emphasized na yung self is supposed to be in the middle. So it's just our way of stressing that it's these three factors that we should take into consideration if we want to develop the interventions. That's it. Thank you.
No, but it's okay. It doesn't, ano naman siya, and it parang structurally or statistically, it doesn't have to be like literally in the center. Actually, pwede siya i-reframe this way. That's okay. I think you explained it very well that basta itong components ito are crucial to lead to a particular desired outcome. So there. Thank you so much. That is very clear and comprehensive. Okay.
So, question, sir. Sorry.
Yes, please, Fatima.
Pwede po ba, sir, na yung self ay not necessarily a person? Could be an institution? Or...
What do you think? Ako, my sense is it has to be a person. Parang specific sila dun sa definition ng self na yung developing sense of awareness and agency. I don't know if others will agree, but
Sa amin, we're supposed to come up with research questions based on the tenets of the sociocultural self model. Tapos, we were not sure. We probably overthought or nag-overthink kami at some point. If we're supposed to think of research questions where we can apply this model to effect change, or if we need research questions to as a framework in order to view or in order to explain certain phenomena.
both
Or if we are tatlo po yun. Or if we are supposed to have questions that challenge or that address the gaps in the model. So, inisip po namin dun sa first option na using the model in order to effect change. Siguro more of the intervention part na yon sa previous pair. So, dun na lang po kami nag-focus dun sa last two parts, yung using the model to explain a way of looking at certain things or phenomena, at saka po yung challenges or gaps in the model. Baka may na-hit naman po kaming spot dun sa original intention for the question. So, po-proceed po muna kami dun.
Kita po ba yung screen?
Yep.
Yep. So, we actually have two research questions. One is using sociocultural self, the model, and relating it to social media and your perceived social ranking, social status ranking. So how does the structure in social media affects wants, SSS, and these structures need to be real. Parang nasagot na yung structures need to be real. So we were talking about, Adi and I were talking about certain personas of influencers and how these supposed to be perceived ranking ng mga influencers affect their behavior, whether it's online or whether it's in real life.
Okay. So, kung tama yung intindi ko, are you saying that so parang may self na na-develop yung influencers, correct?
Yes
So,
po.
ano yung naging role ng social media in kind of developing that? Parang social media as the structure.
Yes po.
And
Yes.
ano yung affordances ng social media and how did it allow for a particular self to develop?
Yes.
Okay. Got it.
Yes po. So thankful we have you, sir. Okay. Our next research question is something about empathy. Ayun. So we wanted to sort of explore the social class affect one's willingness to help, not just like in COVID situation, but we just sort of narrowed it down there. But maybe when there is threat na perceive si individual. I guess babalik kami dito dun sa parang comparison between the readings and the two models, because based on our previous discussion, their empathic tendencies are sort of not dictated, but shaped by your social class. So given the social cultural background or model, how will these pan out? Kasi medyo nag-iiba siya ng konti based on how you perceive it, how you perceive the situation on yourself, and then the interaction thing. Adi, you might wanna add?
Ayun po. Basically, naisip po kasi namin na parang in any almost any research question, this model can be applied. Kasi we can take a look at how different factors or different forces, individual characteristics, structural conditions play a role or take a part in developing a certain self or in shaping the self. So parang for this research question, initially we had our own ideas of which are independent variables or which are dependent variables. Pero parang latter part, we discarded that kasi though yung yung interdependence nga po nung different forces, naisip namin, so baka yung social class and yung crisis or yung situation, yung threat, and even the personal or the individual characteristics of people, they would be interdependent and they will be influencing each other. So that is for a particular study like this, we can take a look at different angles and explain the phenomena based on the social cultural model of self. So yun po yung dalawang naisip namin na research questions dun sa research question as how we are going to use this model in order to explain certain phenomena. So the following two questions or challenges are yun naman to address yung how we would challenge or what are some of our questions regarding the model itself. So, right.
So yun, my first question was the motivation. This was brought about by the congruence. Kailangan aligned si current self as to the desired self that would foster a certain behavior. So my question now is, how does the model, the social-cultural model, account for continued behavior that increases or creates cognitive dissonance? So maybe it has something to do with structure, but I was just thinking about DDS. I'm so sorry I'm using the name, but yeah, those influencers that are like, how do you, maybe wala silang cognitive dissonance, I don't know, but for some who I know have, but still persist on doing those kinds of behavior, like how does this model fit in a way? Kasi parang hindi ko nakita yung motivation part dun sa model. Or maybe I just don't understand it. I don't know. So there, ayun. And also questioning yung, sorry, Adi. No? Yes? Yes? No? Okay.
Okay din.
Okay.
Kasi part din po dun sa motivations na part. Nandun din po kasi yung questions namin. Like for example, katulad sa dinidiscuss kanina, that there seems to be a perpetuating cycle. So parang merong mga given na ito yung mga individual characteristics na or structures na ina-anticipate mo would be in a certain life outcome. But where does it place, for example, those who change social class even without intervention, outside intervention? So the source could be other things like, for example, motivation. So parang in themselves, they changed one of their individual characteristics, for example their drive, and so they were able to and change break out of that perpetuating cycle. Sorry, may
Yes. Tapos po, yun, napasadahan na siya kanina, but we were trying to think that the model is so broad, actually, that we're trying to wrap our minds on how realistic it would be, like it actually creating behavioral change that follows their own model. So alignment of all the three factors that they shared. And yung kay Adi.
I still have dogs. Sorry po. Naririnig pa rin po ba ako?
Yep. Yes. Yep.
Okay. So, yung pong third question namin is about, ako ka po kasi, galing ako sa personality na area. So, when it comes to the model, so like pinag-uusapan namin ni Rice na interdependence of conditions and individual characteristics, check, we agree. The individual characteristics and the conditions influencing behavior, agree. Pero dun po ako naging medyo unsettled dun sa concept of self. Kasi tinititigan ko yung model, and in that model, the self appears to be a separate entity. I'm not sure. Siguro because we are from I am from personality, or siguro din kasi in different classes we are exposed to different ideas of self or of self concept. So parang yung idea of the self as something as a separate entity from the individual characteristics and the conditions, the individual characteristics most especially. Parang doon po ako medyo hindi ko masyadong marap yung aking mind. Kasi based on sa readings, the self is emerging from or a result of the individual characteristics and the structural conditions. So parang, yung self affects these other two factors, but it is mediated by their reaction to these factors, yung thoughts, yung actions nila. But I'd like to view self more as something that's more dynamic. Iniisip ko if maybe the self can influence the other two factors more directly instead of it being mediated only by their reactions. Kasi there could be processes, for example, most especially for between self and individual characteristics. Tapos, yung isa ko pong question is, should self and individual characteristics be separate? Where do the individual characteristics come from? Sinabi po dun sa readings na yung individual characteristics are usually innate, na intrinsic na sila, but without the self, how could they be intrinsic? They will be intrinsic to what? If the self is, ang gulo ko na, if the self is emerging from the individual characteristics, but where would those individual characteristics reside in? if mag-emerge pa lang sa kanya yung self. So, dun po ako medyo need more elaboration.
Yeah.
Huling
I get what you're saying, yeah. Okay.
So,
Sige. I don't know if I can try to resolve this, but can we go back to question number 2? Sorry, class, can you just give me 5 minutes and then I promise to wrap this up. I'm so sorry for the overtime. Just so we have closure, can you go to question number 2, please? Research question number 2.
Okay, wait po.
The one about.
Sure.
So this one. So I think this one, siguro maybe if we're going to refine this a bit, baka mas mapapalutang yung sociocultural model if we focus on parang the social class identity. So yung social class identity more than the social class per se. So kasi ang titignan mo dito yung self, di ba? So pwede kasing what we're trying to drive at here is kagaya na nabanggit nila Mika kanina, may particular silang hypothesis, particular arguments, yung sociocultural model, and then we can just kind of choose one from there and take off from that. No? So kasi, maganda yung point niyo na parang if we put them all together at the same time, parang it's too complicated and maybe it's not feasible to do so even in a research or intervention. So parang we can get one aspect and then run away with that. So halimbawa dito, what I imagine would be, yung importante ba na yung social class identity ko ay congruent sa social class identity ng isang possible COVID patient? And what particular characteristics do I have? Or what particular structural conditions would enable me to be more empathetic toward that possible COVID patient? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So parang ang ilalagay natin ang nakapronta dun sa study ay yung self. So self in the form of whether they identify as middle, upper, lower, ganyan. And what does that mean for them? And tas pwede mong i-test, hindi i-test, pwede mong i-surface to an interview, for instance, whether they do have the tendencies na empathy, etc. And whether it's important that they see the other as similar.
Okay.
So yun siya. Tapos ang excellent point about magkakahiwalay yung model, magkakahiwalay yung components ng model. I don't know if you feel the same way, but my understanding is it's really hard to diagram mutual constitution. I don't know if there's a better way to do it. And I think because they were driving home the point that if you want to do an intervention, you have to tease out these specific, so parang nilabas nila sila kahit na naka-bake in sila sa isa't isa. Does that make sense? Parang hindi talaga sila magkakahiwalay kasi dahil mutually constitutive sila. So they do affect each other. But so for purposes of clarity, I feel to drive home the point that you have 3 factors that you have to look into. Ganun yung itsura ng diet. In fact, nung in-update nila yung theory nila, hindi na sila nangahas na i-represent yung mutual constitution. And I think sila Marcos and Kitayama, at least dun sa ilang articles that I've read, wala silang diagram ng mutual constitution. So yun. That is my take on it. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's how I see it. Okay. So kung wala tayong questions, we're good? Sige.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Good night, everybody.
Sure.
You were awesome. I learned a lot. And please don't forget to upload the photos, the photo versions of the slides, okay?
Okay po.
So,
Noted po,
you.
sir.
Okay, sige. Thank you. Bye-bye. See you next week.